Hello and welcome to FirstFlight, a Star Trek Enterprise rewatch podcast where we are watching and discussing each episode of Enterprise in succession. FirstFlight is a proud member of the Tricorder Transmissions Network.
This is Commander Tucker of Enterprise. We've got some information you're going to want to hear.
Welcome, Enterprise fans. I am your co-host, Melanie.
And I'm your co-host, Abby.
And tonight we are discussing Fusion, the 16th episode of Season 1. This episode was written by Phyllis Strong and Mike Sussman, based on a story by Rick Berman and Brannon Braga. It was directed by Rob Hedden, and it aired on February 27th, 2002. But before we begin our discussion, we need to issue a read alert.
Tactical alert. All hands to stations.
There are potential spoilers ahead. We might end up talking about any part of the series at any time. We also want to issue a trigger warning as the subjects of stalking, predatory behavior, and assault are discussed in this episode. And now, to refresh your memory about Fusion, here's our captain's log. Okay, Abby, let's go.
Captain Starlog Supplemental.
All right, Fusion. My summary: a group of outcast Vulcans who embrace emotion, visit Enterprise, and cause T'Pol to confront new ideas and practices.
All right, let's deploy those subspace amplifiers and get into this. Abby, what are your thoughts on Fusion?
Well, let's start as usual with the cold open. And this one, while not being one of my favorites, is an adorable little moment when you get to see Archer's book and it says Admiral Johnny Archer in it. And T'Pol, one of my favorite lines of the whole episode is she comes in and she goes, "This textbook is what you wanted me to see? Like, what? Why are you showing me this old textbook that's 30 years out of date?" And I just thought that was a really nice way to add a little bit of levity and to show Archer's longing and desire to be out in space and exploring has been there for such a long time. And since he was really young, and what a neat connection to go back to that in the very first part of this episode.
Abby, I loved that just as much as you did. I thought the Johnny Archer piece in the book was absolutely adorable. And it reminds us of those flashbacks in Broken Bow to when he was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of would have liked to seen a few more of those now that I think about it. So that was so sweet. And I loved the interaction between the two of them, the way she says, Admiral Johnny Archer. And can I give a shout out once again to Archer's CDs on his desk? Those 22nd century CDs. Gotta love it.
Yes.
This was a sweet cold open. I really enjoyed it.
Well, besides his CDs, I also like how he's got a gigantic stack of pads. So it shows me that even though it's in the future, your paperwork is still there, even if it's not on paper. And that just made me laugh. If it was me and I was sitting at that desk, I would knock stuff over all the time. Like my elbows would hit those CDs, those pads, all of it. But I like this too because it shows how T'Pol and Archer's relationship has become comfortable and more than just a working relationship. I mean, he's showing her a part of his past. And that's really nice because this entire episode is bookended by Archer and T'Pol scenes. And I really enjoyed that this one shows how much he's coming to trust her and confide in her. And even on things that are little, but sometimes it's those little things that make the relationship deepen.
Yeah, now that you mention that, it is really endearing that he thought to call upon her, like, hey, I have something to show you. I love the way their relationship is developing. And I like that they took it out of the potential romantic territory. That's just my personal opinion. Other people may feel differently, but I like the episodes where that's not teased to us. You know what I mean?
Agreed. So let's move on to another early scene in here, which is food and eating, which is so joyous for me every time that I rewatch Enterprise, and I watch the food in particular now because it's so quirky. Like, before we go into what actually happens in this scene, can I just say that Tavis, besides the fact that he ends up eating the chicken later, he gets an entire artichoke on his plate. Now, I love artichokes, but that is not going to be something that you want to necessarily eat in company you've just met. If you're eating an entire artichoke like that, if you're pulling it apart, dipping it in something, you're going to get messy. So that just, in my humble opinion, would not be something that I would serve to guests, especially Vulcans who are fairly particular. I mean, T'Pol cuts her breadstick with a fork and a knife, and we don't know yet that these are unusual Vulcans. So I'm just thinking, as much as I love Chef, that was an interesting choice for the first meeting with somebody, to give them an entire artichoke on the plate.
You know, Abby, I didn't notice the artichoke, so I'm glad you mentioned that so I can go find it. That is a very difficult item of food to eat for humans who are more familiar with it. I was looking for the Vulcan food. When Archer said, you know, our chef has learned to approximate Vulcan food, I was kind of trying to figure out, what did they give them? Did you notice anything Vulcan? I was just curious.
I thought the same thing, and I didn't see anything that looked specifically Vulcan, but there was a big bowl of something that could maybe be plomeek soup.
Right.
And that's what I was thinking. And I did notice an array of different it looked like vegetables and grains. And we know that they enjoy giving T'Pol plates of just, veggies, because obviously Vulcans don't need the protein that we do. But I didn't notice anything specific, but I'm curious to see what Chef would whip up if it was a full Vulcan meal. And interesting that they made the choice to still have a meat option, even though they ate with who they assumed were vegetarians.
That's true. Archer decides, just to eat what he would normally eat. And that was interesting. I love these captain's mess scenes. In addition to observing the food, there's so much interesting dialogue going on in so many different episodes. This brings me back to Breaking the Ice and Unexpected and all those other episodes where we're having these really fascinating conversations in the captain's mess. And this is no exception. There's obviously very interesting exposition going on here. And I particularly love the reaction shots of T'Pol, where there's
Yes.
not just one, there's at least 3 or 4, maybe 3 reaction shots every time either Tavin or Talaris says something that surprises her. We get a reaction shot. And I found that all very intriguing.
Yeah, Jolene's face acting in this episode gets a beyond A+. It's always good, but this episode, the subtle nuances and just the way she flicks her eyes or she tilts her chin, it's wonderful work because she doesn't have to say anything and you understand what's going on. And I really enjoy too that she is figuring this out, what's going on with these Vulcans, as we are. And you can see that in her whole body changes, the posture. And she's got great posture, but she's just a little bit straighter at certain points. And the camera angles on this are very interesting. You don't always get the same shot of her when their reactions. You're seeing over people's shoulders and around the table and different combos of people in these shots. So it was really well done. And I have to second what you said about enjoying the scenes in the captain's mess and in the mess hall. Because, when I think about my family growing up and currently, the dinner table or the lunch table, when we're eating together, that is the time that we talk and we bring things up and we discuss. And we always talk about Enterprise being like a family. And where else would you sit down and have these kind of discussions but over a meal? So while people might deride Enterprise for having so much food in it, I think it's very realistic. And I think it is kind of one of the things that I like because it feels familiar. Like this is how this would go if you lived on a ship with all these people and you had to eat 3 times a day.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I wanted to talk a little bit about this conversation that they're having in the captain's mess. But first, let me back up a moment and talk a little bit about my pros and cons about this episode, which will weave into my thoughts. I think this episode is really well executed. There's some really good acting, very interesting concepts, and more T'Pol development, which I absolutely love. And I think that the concept of the Vitoshka tour is really, really interesting, which we're hearing about in this mealtime scene. when, Archer says later, maybe they're onto something. Maybe they're
Mhm.
finding a balance. I think the concept of it is really intriguing. But the way T'Pol was approached almost as being recruited in an aggressive manner, I think for me, if T'Pol had been intrigued with the Vatosh Couture, heard about it, and maybe approached them with some interest without the icky, predatory part of this episode, for me, that might have felt a little bit more interesting. But right in this meal scene, from the very first camera shot of Talaris, oh my gosh, his icky predatory nature just oozes from the very first shot and continues to be very over the top throughout the episode. I think Enrique Marciano is a really good actor, and he does a good job at playing creepy. I mean, he lays on and overdoes the creepiness very, very well. And even later on the Vulcan ship, when he's talking to her and backing her around that center console, like just walking at her and she's backing off, and he's walking at her and she's backing off, that it's like he's targeting her from the very beginning and being predatory and, trying to recruit her, etc. And so that, if that had been handled differently, it might have been, I think, a little more interesting to me. But back to the scene, from the very first shot, as I mentioned, of his face, looking at her and leering at her and smirking at her, wow, they definitely get the point across very quickly. What do you think?
Yeah, I am wondering from the very beginning, like as soon as he realized there was a Vulcan on the ship, was this his plan immediately? Was he grooming her? Was he looking to recruit her? Would it have been the same if she had been a male Vulcan? I don't know. He's definitely a skeevtastic bad guy. He can go hang out with Shran's Andorian friend for all that I care. But I do wonder, like, how much of this was he wanted T'Pol as another Vulcan? How much of it was he wanted actual T'Pol? How much of it was it that, we didn't see any females on the ship with these guys? Maybe they're all awakening other things that with their emotions. And it's hard to tell. And had this been a 2-part story, or had we come back around to him later on, we might have gotten some of that. But yeah, he immediately is just yuck. And I think that does credit a lot back to the actor, because even the way that he walks, that he stands, how he puts his hands behind his back, which pushes his like chest and shoulders and face forward all the time. So it almost feels like he's hovering over her, that too close to people feeling. That was well done, because it almost could have been played as this is just a Vulcan and he's just being Vulcan-y, but it was just that one little bit too far. And he's an interesting character, because I have to say, jumping forward a little bit to his conversation with T'Pol in the mess hall, the first half of that conversation where they're talking about why does she choose to serve on the ship, and she had been in the compound in San Francisco for a long time, and it's affected her in ways it didn't expect. And those were all good, relevant, valid, not skeevy questions. Had somebody else asked them, or he had asked them in a different way, I think T'Pol would have pondered them differently, because there were things in there I was like, yeah, you know what? Icky guy has a good point. And quickly that dissipated. But in the beginning, he had some food for thought there.
I completely agree. I took a note on that also. He was pretty insightful when he said to her, you have a sense of humor.
Yeah.
Your emotions are closer to the surface than a typical Vulcan's, which we've talked about T'Pol on numerous occasions and will continue to talk about as we move forward. He has good insights. He is asking good questions. And again, I think if the story had been told that way, like this could have been done one of two ways. It could have been, let's focus on the Vatosh Couture and what does that mean for T'Pol and her interest in that, or just this predatory assault story, which they decided to go with and to focus more on that part, which is, again, what we're going to talk about since that's what the episode is. But I think there were some valid questions that he asked that were natural to ask. It's just that he keeps, like you said, hovering, like when she's getting the tea. the way he's standing over her and looking down at her face, like 6 inches away from her face, was all so very disturbing. And she clearly picked up on that because she's trying to get the heck out of there.
Yeah, I wish sometimes that they would have played this differently, because I think the interesting part of this story is that T'Pol is interested in possibly finding a way to balance emotionality with all of her previous Vulcan training. We see that she's intrigued enough to say possibly later. And I do not think at all for one iota of time she's intrigued with him. She's intrigued with the ideas. And had she gone to the captain instead, if he had been the one to approach her, what a different story this would have been. And she still would have maybe ended up in the same position at the end, but it would have had a whole different tone.
Very interesting. Good point. Because we do want to learn more about T'Pol's interest in her emotions. And clearly from the beginning, this was a story about assault.
Right.
And again, the episode is well acted and there's some interesting concepts, but it is mighty, mighty disturbing.
Well, and I think it's interesting, and it goes to the point that she's interested in the idea of finding an emotional balance, because she does take the advice and doesn't meditate and has that dream and remembers a time when her emotions were closer to the surface in the jazz club. And that had nothing to do with these Vulcans. That was something that was already in T'Pol. It was part of her and part of her history, and probably one of the reasons that she was so intrigued when they came in contact with these guys, because she has had this little spark. And like she said, once, but once was enough for her to not forget it. It was a big enough impact on her that she didn't forget. And I think that's really interesting that that was kind of the main focal point of her dream, was the jazz and the jazz music and the chaos, and that she is attracted to chaotic things, whether it be humans, whether it be space travel, whether it be music. That's a part of T'Pol that is very critical to the type of Vulcan that she is.
Yeah, you can definitely see the conflict in T'Pol because she is interested in this concept, but at the same time, she makes a point of saying very clearly to them on several occasions, you are choosing a reckless path. This could never work. It is very dangerous. She's very clear in making her opinion known to them. But at the same time, she's intrigued.
Can't help but wonder.
Can't help but wonder, which is a tough position for T'Pol to be in. And you mentioned the lack of meditating. I also wanted to point out that moment where he says to her, don't meditate tonight. He doesn't say, you may want to consider not meditating. Not meditating is something that's very helpful to us. But the way he says, don't do it, that was a command. And Talaris is very commanding. I didn't like the way he spoke to her like that. They could have had an actual respectful conversation about it, but he was like, don't do it. You know what I mean?
Fed right into his creepiness.
Oh, terrible.
So I have to say, when I look at the whole meld scene, it is kind of hit you over the head obvious, but the intensity isn't any worse for it. And when at the end of it, he walks out and says, what a shame. You almost embraced your emotions. She could have embraced her anger and kicked him in the head, and I would not have been sad at all. But what an interesting way to get T'Pol into a meld and to show how intimate it truly is. And wow, for her to have broken the meld like that, that speaks highly of our T'Pol and her strength of mind.
Abby, I'm glad you mentioned that thing about T'Pol embracing her anger, because, oh my gosh, this was infuriating. Yes, she did have enormous strength to push him away, and good for her. And when he did say, what a shame, what an icky moment, an icky thing to say. So this is just horrific for T'Pol. T'Pol is a survivor, and there are going to be ramifications of this assault moving forward throughout the series, with the Pinar syndrome and her being stigmatized and all of that. And we really empathize with her and applaud her strength in dealing with this trauma.
Let's talk about the end where Archer talks to Talaris and they have that kind of trap that he plans in the ready room. That's an awesome scene. I mean, that is Archer coming through. And while I think that he would have done that for anybody on the ship, that's the kind of guy he is. The fact that it was to Paul and that he'd been the one to originally encourage this, he was not letting this creep get away. And bravo to Archer for that. And he took quite a throw across the room for that one, or, his stunt double did. And what an interesting and smart way, if dangerous, to trap him into showing his true colors.
Yeah, that was a fantastic scene. And I agree with you on all points. Very clever of Archer. Love the way it was played, where at the beginning it's so casual and he leads him right into that trap. I love when Archer says, "You assaulted a member of my crew." Mm-hmm. Boom. Another disturbing part of this scene is when Talaris says to Archer, well, she willingly participated in this meld. And if we're going with the sexual assault analogy, that is just classic unacknowledgement of her withdrawal of consent, which is unacceptable. That was a really great scene. My only wish is that after that scene, I realized that this could have taken place off camera. So I want to say I fully acknowledge that, but I wish there had been some type of warning to the other ship or consequence, even more importantly for Talaris, because I wish that Archer had contacted the captain and say, hey, you have a predator on your hands, or I would have liked to have seen some consequence. Again, that could have happened after the episode wrapped because he really deserved it. But I absolutely loved that scene, which leads us into the final T'Pol Archer scene, which I thought was fantastic. As I mentioned, there are some good aspects to this episode for me. This is one of them. When Archer says to T'Pol, oh, you do this every night? Yes, meditate every night. And he says, I think I finally understand why. That's a brilliant, beautiful moment. Well written.
Yeah, like I said at the beginning, I like how there are Archer T'Pol scenes that bookend this episode. And this is like the most T'Pol conversation ever. It's like that look that we've talked about where she won't directly answer a question because she's back and forthing and giving information, but not a lot. And I love how when he says, are you feeling better? And she asks if the Vulcan ship has left. And he's like, yeah. And she goes, yeah, then I'm feeling better. That's the perfect T'Pol answer right there. And this shows the relationship again that, yeah, they work together, but they're getting to be friends now too. And they can have those quiet moments of understanding where they say so much more. And previously, we've really only seen Archer do that with Trip. So it's nice that comes here too. And we're seeing that he's starting to have a deeper relationship with T'Pol in many areas. And before we leave this scene, I have to just say that Scott Bakula must have some mighty strong thighs because he squats for about 70% of this scene. Like she's on the floor on her cushion meditating and he comes in, talks for a second and then squats down. That's a long squat. It's a really long squat. And then he gets right back up and saunters back. And it's none of the like shaky leg that I know I personally would have had if I had just squatted and had that conversation for that long. And it made for some gorgeous shots. So good job to our director here because it made for some really nice camera work. But poor Scott Bakula, he could skip leg day this week.
Now that you mention it, I do remember that, and that does take a lot of strength. And I agree with you. The directing in this episode is really excellent. You mentioned earlier about the different camera angles and the mess hall scene and all of that. I mean, Captain's Mess, sorry. Yeah, there's some really good directing here. And I'm so glad you mentioned is the Vulcan ship gone line. I love that line. There's T'Pol's humor again. Well, I should say more vulnerability. That's a very, very good line. And it was definitely coming deep from her heart. She wanted them the heck out of there, as we all did. Mm-hmm. So this is a good scene. I also thought it was interesting in this scene when she asked him about his dreams that she said, I envy you, where envy is clearly an emotion and something that Vulcans would not claim to do. But because she's been through so much and this was an emotional episode, quote unquote. It doesn't surprise me that she said that during their heart-to-heart talk, but I thought that was an interesting choice of words.
Yeah. Well, we can't leave this episode without talking about the B plot, because the B plot might be one of my favorite parts of this episode. What a nice story, and what a way to show two of our main characters in different capacities. And I mean, starting out from when Admiral Forrest calls all the way to the end where, Trip gets the confirmation that Kov really has talked to his dad. This was a great little mini arc in this episode.
I completely agree. I enjoyed this arc very much. There's many parts of it I want to talk about. I thought that Trip and Kov had really good rapport, and I loved their conversations, clearing up the misconceptions. Their whole scene in the mess hall was really great, and I really enjoyed their connections.
I agree. I think it was nice to see them building this up throughout the episode, and they started with the misconceptions, and then it got a little bit more intense, and they talked a little bit more about feelings and all of that. And then by the end, they really are, I think, friends. And how disappointing that time had to be cut short because of everything else that was going on with other visitors from the Vulcan ship. But what a moment of levity in the episode that is a bit heavy when they're in the mess hall and they're talking about the misconceptions and eating some very good veggie pasta, might I add. But I liked that. The counterbalance there was just a really nice thing, and how fun it must have been to think up how human behaviors could be misinterpreted. Because, as someone who has football on at their house a lot and other people are watching it, that could be what you interpret football as being.
Yeah, that was funny. And I have to say, I did enjoy the Kov, Malcolm, Trip, Ponfar conversation. There was some great facial expressions from Malcolm here. And I have to say, that did make me smile. Here's my question to you, Abby. Do you think Malcolm heard them talking about it, and that's why he walked over to be like, hello, and kind of embarrassed Trip? Or do you think he just happened to be passing by? Because it sounds like a lot of the mess hall heard what they were talking about.
My guess is that Malcolm was going to probably come over and chat with them anyway, but on the way, I think he absolutely heard it and changed how he was going to worm his way into the conversation because of it. And I do appreciate that little kind of hush that fell in the mess hall. That would have really happened. And again, look at the character development and the little moments that we're getting because they're sitting in a common place eating. So I love our Enterprise food moments.
Most definitely. We love them. And I love that in that moment when Malcolm came over, I couldn't help but think of Shuttle Pod 1 just happening and thinking that Trip and Malcolm are on another level now. And, Malcolm can kind of joke around with Trip. And I enjoyed that. And I really enjoyed Kov. And I thought that was a good part of the episode.
Yeah. And I enjoy that at the end, he has kind of taken that step, and that shows almost as much emotional growth as anything else that we see from him in the episode.
Yeah, that was very, very good to see and a great way to end it. And then there's a look on Trip's face where he feels satisfied that he came through, that he made his point. He felt good about helping. We've seen this on Trip before, like in Breaking the Ice when he helped T'Pol. Trip likes to help people, and he feels good when he does. And he did a damn good job doing it, too, throughout that whole scene where he's talking about the elementary school dance and all of that. Trip is insightful, and he does think quickly about the right thing to say. I was impressed with Trip's actions in this episode. That was really nice to see. So in dealing with Kov, I guess we should talk about this situation with his father being ill. And that brings us to, I did want to talk a little bit about the Forrest and Archer comm scene.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we had spoken about that in Shadows of Pajem. And here we have another one, another great scene between Forrest and Archer, where once again, it is understood that Forrest is the superior. and Archer needs to follow his instructions. But Archer does not once say, sir, in this scene, just like Shadows of Pajem. He does not call him sir. Maybe at Starfleet, maybe back home he would, but they have enough of a casual relationship where the relationship is understood, but they don't need to be that formal, because Jonathan Archer is in a very special, unique position, and Forrest knows that. However, when Forrest does make the request of Archer and Archer says, I'll see what I can do about it, Forrest does sense that's not good enough. He's feeling some resistance from Archer, like, okay, I'll see what I can do about it. He kind of looks away when he says it. And that's when Forrest says, well, hey, they let you keep your science officer. We need to help them now. So that's where he's like, you got to do this. And then Archer's like, understood. I thought that was really intriguing because that wasn't good enough for him. Do you know what I mean? That was my interpretation of it, I should say.
I think that's interesting. And that scene made me think about how Archer understands both sides of that conversation, because he has that relationship that you just described with Forrest, but he is in the opposite seat in his relationship with Trip. And there have been times where those men are obviously very close friends, but he will be the captain and pull rank. And Trip doesn't always say yes, sir. I mean, he does sometimes, and it almost feels sassy because of the relationship that they already have. Like he's saying, okay, well, you're stepping out of our friendship zone now and going to the captain. That's when he says yes, sir. So what an interesting thing to look at Archer, who has to do both of these roles, and for him to understand how important it is on both sides.
Definitely. Archer has a lot to balance, and he's so instinctual. I know we're talking about the B plot, but something just popped up for me about the A plot when Archer says to Trip, tell me about this Talaris guy. Archer's having some instincts. He's sensing, at least to me, he's sensing that something might be a little amiss here. And I appreciated that he pointed that out. Like, what's up with this guy? It seemed to me like Archer was like, maybe getting a little bit of a bad vibe. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that could be part of it. Absolutely. And that he trusts Trip enough to bring it up to him. And Trip is comfortable enough of throwing his very differing viewpoint out. And I love in this scene when the two of them are talking, they're working again. They're walking around and they're doing stuff. These men never sit down and just like have a chat over a cup of coffee or whatever. They're either eating a meal or they're fixing something or doing something, because that's how they feel that they can really be more vulnerable. And that is such a cool part of their relationship.
Abby, I thought of you and I thought of that when I saw this scene. I knew you were going to say that because you've helped me keep an eye out for that. I had the exact same thought. Here they are working and having a serious discussion again. Love it.
Yeah, so no matter what you are thinking about this episode and the different A and B plots, one of the things that does shine through on both of them are the relationships. The relationships, the new ones, the old ones, the deep ones, the growing ones. And that is something that Enterprise really does well. Even in the episodes that might not make anyone's top 10 list, you still find those little bits that are really endearing to our crew.
Absolutely. Okay, we hear Porthos barking, so that must mean it's time for our favorite part of the episode. Abby, what's your Porthos's pick this time?
Well, I have to say that what really jumped out at me, we were just talking about relationships, is the Phlox and T'Pol sickbay scene, because they have a completely unique relationship on the ship. They are the two non-humans, and we've seen this over this first season. While it's not ever something that is the main focus, it comes up over and over and over again. And they have conversations and can move the plot in different ways because of that. And they really do a nice job of putting a lot of different perspective on things. And I enjoy how Phlox sees that T'Pol tried something and it was unusual for her. And he doesn't want to make her feel bad for exploring different parts of her, but he still wants to caution that this might be something you need to let somebody know about or to go slowly. And what an Denobulans are big and bold and loving and effusive in everything they do, and Vulcans are not. So what an interesting little snippet of a conversation. And you can see T'Pol really thinks this over. She values what he says, and she's taking it under consideration. And I just really liked that little bit, a very quiet, simple scene in this episode.
That's a good pick. I really enjoyed the scene also. It was very lovely. And as we've mentioned before, the Phlox T'Pol scenes in Enterprise in general are very strong, very powerful, but always really good. And my favorite part of that scene was actually the humorous moment when T'Pol is instructing Phlox on to what administer to her. Okay, I just need 25 cc's of inaprovaline or whatever it was. It's always inaprovaline. We have to get our hands on some inaprovaline in this century because it would do wonders.
I wish. Yeah.
But when he says to her, okay, thank you, doctor, or whatever his exact quote was when he's calling her the doctor, I found that so delightful and endearing. I loved that. And this was a wonderful scene.
So how about you, Melanie? What's your favorite part of this episode?
Well, can I just say that I thought Trip's dancing was pretty cool?
Yes.
I did love Trip's little dance, which leads me into my favorite part. Once again, Trip in this episode and in general, but particularly in this scene, is so insightful. I love the way he thinks of the right thing to say. And when he says to Kov, okay, hey, you're learning about emotions. Let me give you a little clue here. Regret is one of the strongest emotions and one of the saddest of our emotions. That is something you might want to avoid. There is a real powerful and poignant and very truthful message here. It really resonated with me, and I love the way Trip delivered that. That was such an important and powerful thing to say to Kov. And just for everyone to hear, I'll just speak for myself. That was my favorite part. I loved the writing of it, the delivery of it, and the message behind it. And for people who are learning about their emotions, that's very, very helpful information. So I really enjoyed that part.
Yeah, Trip is the opposite of T'Pol in this episode. He has no problem accessing the emotions and speaking out. And that's one of the reasons that we love him as part of our crew, because he kind of feels first and then puts everything else behind. And that's somebody that you like to be around. That's a very endearing quality. And this was a wonderful scene. Very moving.
Accessing library computer data.
All right, let's hear some trivia about this episode. Abby, what do you have for us about fusion?
Well, I have just one little thing here, but it's a good one. The jazz club in the flashback that T'Pol has in her dream is called Fusion, which is the title of this episode. And I've always found that just a fun little wink and a tiny little crack in that fourth wall.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I actually did have a note about this and forgot to say it. I have seen this episode since 2002 when it debuted, and I never noticed the sign on the door until this rewatch. I always thought fusion was called fusion because of the fusing of emotions and logic and all of that. And then when I was watching it, I realized it's more like jazz fusion, and I saw the club title.
Mm-hmm.
That was super cool. Very clever of them.
So what did you find out about this episode for us, Melanie?
I learned that Robert Pine, the actor who plays the Vulcan captain Taven, is the father of actor Chris Pine, who we know from the Kelvin universe as Captain Kirk. I thought that was super interesting, and I actually could see the resemblance.
That is interesting. And I love, there's kind of the saying, sci-fi takes care of its own. And once you get an acting or a producing or directing job in sci-fi, then you're pretty much set, because everyone else in sci-fi will take care of you and your kids. And here's an example of that. And that's kind of a heartwarming thing to be out there in the universe.
It is.
Transfer of data is complete.
Well, we've arrived at our Vulcan's verdict. On a scale of 1 to 10 grapplers, how are you rating fusion, Abby?
Well, I love T'Pol-centered stories, but this one is just icky. Like, you watch it because it sets up so many little threads and crumbs that continue for all 4 seasons. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate them not letting this be a one-off thing. I like that continuation. But when you look at this as a standalone, it's just hard. And some of the better moments are overshadowed by the last third of this episode, which is so heavy-handed. But there's a lot of good things in there too. So I'm giving it a 5.5 grapplers this week.
Yeah, I'm on the same page as you. As I mentioned, while I would love to see a story about nonconformist Vulcans who are trying something new, where they're not necessarily painted as bad guys or a bad guy, that would be interesting. Given the story we were given, there are some interesting concepts here. There are some strengths to this episode. I do like the T'Pol development. I do like the acting. I really enjoyed that B story. But the underlying theme of this assault and predatory behavior was just really, really hard to take and very upsetting. So I ended up giving it 5.5 grapplers as well.
My chronometer's running backwards, sir.
Incoming transmission.
You read my letter?
All right, it's time for Daniels to send us back in the timeline so we can hear from you. Abby, what do you have for us?
I have 2 for us tonight. The first one is about the episode Dear Doctor, and it's from our friend Peter Trek 1 on Twitter. And he says, when I first watched Dear Doctor, I also thought of TNG's Data's Day, which had a very similar story structure, having a main character provide a voiceover describing a typical day on board the Enterprise. I liked Enterprise's version a bit more than TNG's version, because the stakes were higher and because the concept of the Prime Directive was introduced in this story. I would give this episode 8 of 10 grapplers. So yay! We loved when you guys send in grappler ratings. It's interesting to see how much everybody's thoughts and opinions vary. And our second one tonight is just kind of almost a little tease, and this is about Shadows of Pajem, and it's from Yair Cohen, which is Yair, Y-A-I-R, Cohen, C-O-H-E-N, first, number 1, ST. And he says, Shadows of Pajem is such a good episode that gives a lot of background and context regarding the foundation of the United Federation of Planets. And this one little comment led to a discussion on Twitter about why there should be an Andorian emoji. So I strongly suggest to anybody, if you are so inclined, come check out the discussions that come on Twitter and Instagram about each of our episodes, because they are fun and delightful, and we love the community and the people that we have gotten to know because of them.
Yeah, I'm on board with Yair also. I love these episodes that talk about the founding of the Federation and the history of the founding of the Federation. I know that he enjoys that as much as we do. And yes, there definitely, most positively, has to be an Andorian emoji. Let's bring it on. And if you would like to continue the discussion with us, we can be found at FirstFlight Pod on Twitter and Instagram. And how about you, Abby? Where can we reach you?
Best place to find me is on Twitter, and that's Abby M. Sommer, S-O-M-M-E-R.
We really appreciate you listening and spending this time with us. And we'll be back next time with Rogue Planet, the 17th episode of Season 1. And as always, we leave you with this quote from Captain Jonathan Archer. The most profound discoveries are not necessarily beyond that next star. They're within us, woven into the threads that bind us, all of us, to each other.